Facing charges over the deaths of civilians in Egypt, former President Hosni Mubarak is back in court. Legal proceedings begin against leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood. And deposed President Mohamed Morsi stands accused of murder. But with the world watching, is Egypt's judicial system also on trial? This is Inside Story. Welcome to the programme. I'm Shihab Ratansi. They're from opposing sides, but all stand accused over the deaths of protesters in Egypt. Important figures facing trial against a backdrop of continued tension and political turmoil, placing the judicial system under the spotlight. Former President Hosni Mubarak is being retried for ordering the killing of demonstrators during the uprising that forced him from office. And three leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood, including General Guide Mohammed Badieh, are charged with inciting the murder of protesters. The first proceedings against them since elected President Mohamed Morsi was deposed on July the 3rd. And Morsi himself is facing a variety of spying and jailbreak charges and is accused by prosecutors of participating in the murder of civilians. To our discussion on the pursuit of justice in Egypt in a moment. But first, Mike Hanna reports for Inside Story from Cairo.
Any legal system would come under pressure when one president was on trial, let alone two. That is the situation in Egypt. You have two ex-presidents facing two separate court processes. In the case of Mohamed Morsi, formal charges still to be laid, but the prosecutors say he will appear before the court at a date to be announced. Now, stripped to its elementals, the Egyptian justice system is very simple. The chief prosecutor will investigate charges, he will draw them up, present them before a judge. The defense will then provide their rebuttal, put that before the judge. The judge will then decide on the documents before him and rule accordingly. It is a system that is transparent and indeed protective of individual human rights. But there are variables in the persona of those involved. The chief prosecutor, a critical position. In the case of Hosni Mubarak, for instance, the then chief prosecutor took 2 months after Mubarak's deposition before even beginning an investigation. That is why the court proceedings took so long, and that is why Mubarak was essentially freed by a judge, because he had gone past the maximum 2-year period in which a prisoner is allowed to be in prison before his case is concluded. We have a new prosecutor who has been appointed by the interim government put in place by the military. Now, this prosecutor has acted with blinding speed. He has assembled charges against senior members of the Muslim Brotherhood within days of their arrest. They're in court already. They have already heard the charges against them. That case remanded. You now have a situation, Hosni Mubarak on trial, Morsi soon to go on trial. The judges will be in focus in this. They insist, they decide on what is before them. Personal opinions, emotions do not come into play. Well, what is happening here is not just the trial of two ex-presidents, it's also a trial of the entire judicial system. Mike Hanna for Inside Story in Cairo.
Let's bring in our guests. In Cairo, we have Helia, non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution's Foreign Policy section. And joining us from London is international lawyer and political analyst Saad Jabbar. Well, let's take a closer look at the charges against Hosni Mubarak. Last year, he was found guilty of failing to stop the killing of protesters during the 2011 uprising. He was sentenced to life in prison. But an appeal was filed and a retrial ordered. Mubarak appeared in court on Sunday for that retrial. The former president is also facing separate charges over corruption cases. He's accused of accepting $11 million worth of gifts, including jewelry and watches from a state-run newspaper. He's also accused of embezzling money from presidential funds and making illicit gains during his presidency. Helia, then, first of all, though, as far as Sunday's trial is concerned, though, the murder charges and the corruption charges seem to have been elided somewhat. They've been sort of stuck together. Is there any reason for that, as far as you can see?
That's not been made very clear, at least on the ground in Cairo. The situation is as at present that he has been released into military custody. He's under military, quote-unquote, house arrest. He's being held at a military hospital in a suburb of Cairo. And because of the symbolism, I think, relating to this case, particularly the timing of it, so soon after Mohammed Morsi was forced out of power, I think that the authorities want to rush forward in seeing where this case actually takes them.
There were various pledges of transparency from the judge, Judge Mahmoud Kamel al-Rashidi, which are very welcome, I suppose. But do we know much about this judge? Is he someone who has a reputation for not falling under political interference, for example?
There are very few judges that would be able to claim that across the board. You've seen that over the past few years. With this judge in particular, it's still unclear. And one has to keep in mind that over the past few years, there have been several high-profile cases where assumptions were made about the political leanings of a judge one way or the other, and then surprises took place. So it's very difficult to predict how this is going to go.
Saad Jabbar, what are your expectations for this trial? Are you expecting proceedings to be handled with integrity and without political interference?
No military rule in the world, either in history or in the near or the modern history, where the judiciary is independent. From Latin America to Asia to Africa, when you have a military regime, the judges always take heed of what the military or what the regime wants. No checks and balances exist in a dictatorship. Let's not kid ourselves. Let's not talk about the personalities, the individuals or the individual judges. In Egypt, the leader of the coup pledged and said that lions don't eat their babies. And he said, and the Egyptian army is a lion. In other words, Mubarak was in the military, head of the military. He spent his life in the military. Therefore, the army, now the military regime, will not allow the continued imprisonment of Mubarak. In addition, Saudi Arabia is very well known to have always called for the release of Hosni Mubarak. And now it will be very difficult for the military regime to keep Mubarak there. And if anything, if in the best of circumstances, maybe they wanted to stick as many charges as possible against Morsi. So therefore, in any future clemency or amnesty, it would be, you know, across the board, presidents or whatever should be released or pardoned or whatever. But I doubt it very much.
Hisham, Helia, do you share that assessment? This is really a foregone conclusion.
I'm not so sure if it's a foregone conclusion, only insofar as we know that within the state itself, as well as the judiciary, there isn't a single opinion with regards to Hosni Mubarak and the trial. And we've seen that quite a few times over the past few years, that within the judiciary itself, even though they were extremely loyal to one part of the state, they might have harbored resentment towards another. So the trial that took place under Tantawi, under Morsi, these are different parts of the state working at different points in time. So I don't think it's a foregone conclusion precisely which way the political leanings actually are directed at present with regards to within the court system itself. I think that we do have to wait and see. I think more importantly, we have to look at how strong the case itself actually is for the prosecution. Some criticisms have been made so far about the weakness of the case as has been presented,
right.
Not with regards to whether or not Hosni Mubarak is guilty or not guilty of particular crimes, but the way in which the case has already been presented may actually prove to be a stumbling block.
Yeah, it was notable that both those on the prosecution and the defense team seemed relieved that the last ruling was overruled precisely because the case seemed so weak. What went so terribly wrong, Hisham?
I think that the type of evidence that was used and the line of authority that was established is ordinarily quite difficult to actually establish, and I don't think that I don't think they used all the evidence that might have been able to actually bolster their case. And you've seen this in other cases as well, where it seems very blatantly clear as to what the ruling should be or shouldn't be, but then the evidence presented isn't done in precisely the correct manner. So if there's an ironclad case and the judge simply dismisses it, then you can see certain things there, right? But when the case itself hasn't been established and presented in the best possible light, then there are many other ways that you can see the case going from within the judiciary itself. But I would caution against establishing from the outset a type of support for Mubarak as a person from within the state. Even while Mubarak was president, there was significant opposition to him as an individual, not necessarily the system, but to him as an individual from within the state. He was incredibly unpopular, for example, within the foreign ministry. He was incredibly unpopular within different parts of the state apparatus as a person. While the system itself definitely wanted to protect itself, I wouldn't assume automatically that Mubarak has all of the friends that he may be accused of having beyond Egypt.
Right, and before I'll put that to Saad Jabbar in a moment, that perhaps the system isn't as monolithic as he's arguing, but just to quickly run through why the evidence in the last Mubarak trial was so flawed. We have this criticism from a leading NGO in Egypt, the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights. They called the last case flawed and disappointing. They said the retrial must avoid what it called the grave mistakes of the first. Quote, statements by more than 1,300 witnesses were disregarded at the original trial. Medical reports, video footage and evidence of weapons and live ammunition were ignored, all of which the group says indicated police involvement in the killing of demonstrators. And Saad Jabbar, I mean, that the implication there was much of this evidence wasn't included precisely, though, not to implicate the security forces in any wrongdoing.
Well, it was obvious that, you know, the apparatus of our security apparatus, which is about 1 million, and the police and so on, wouldn't have allowed, because they are the first investigators, and the prosecution will receive evidence from the police or from the military police and so on. But it will not, even for the life of me, I couldn't have imagined that the old regime, the same system, would have passed on to the judiciary or to the prosecutors at least any evidence which might implicate their bosses, their minister, or the president, because it will go down, you know, to everyone who's senior. And remember what we have seen when the Sisi called for, you know, for the toppling of Mr. Morsi, how the many senior police officers were demonstrating in favor of the toppling of Mr. Morsi. So the only thing they haven't cleansed from this, you know, the files and so on, was the names of the Baltajiyya, of the thugs, of the informants, of those drug dealers whom the police were dealing with or using. And therefore, I couldn't believe that they will present anything which might incriminate irrevocably the president or the minister of the interior. I'll expect the minister of the interior and others will be released soon as well. But wait until and see how much evidence will be presented against Mr. Morsi, with videotapes, with listening device, you know, with evidence from listening to the phone, of tapping, even from, you know, right, from pictures which might have been put in the Muslim Brothers' offices or the presidential office.
We'll get on to the case against the Muslim Brotherhood in a moment, but Hisham, Helia, I guess that is a key point, though. We would expect more evidence to be introduced in this trial of Mubarak, at the very least, though.
One would hope so, and I think it's very important for your viewers to look carefully at the Egyptian Initiative for Personal Rights report. It's on EIPR.org, because they list quite clearly for everybody precisely what the flaws were, and incidentally the legal necessity for actually releasing Mubarak when they did a few days ago. I think it's very important to get the facts of the case right in order to know where the weaknesses were and what corrections need to be made. Whether they're made or not is an entirely different question, and I think a healthy amount of skepticism in that regard is certainly warranted. But I think that we do have to be clear about the facts of the case and how And when I say the case, I don't just mean the legal case itself, but how it's being presented at present, and how the judiciary is or is not going to move forward with it. There are many reasons to be very skeptical, but we do have to know why it's quite possible that this won't go the way that many people hope.
I mean, clearly a great deal rests then with the Prosecutor General. Mike Cano a moment ago was just telling us how the previous Prosecutor General moved very slowly on this case, and that's one of the reasons, of course, why Mubarak was released, because procedurally he had served the maximum pre-trial detention period. What about the current Prosecutor General, Hesham Barakat? Tell us more about him. Does he have any clear political affiliations? Has he been a defender of judicial independence? Hisham, Helia.
There are reports that he was earlier on, but you have to keep in mind that the situation right now isn't one of coercion. Okay, the implication in a lot of these questions, not on your program, but around the case itself, is whether or not the judiciary is being coerced in trying to come to one ruling or another. The situation in Egypt right now is incredibly polarized, and a great majority is polarized in favor of the military and in favor of the current narrative that is being presented in the national arena.
But what, so the law means nothing now? Is it clear that, I mean, is there
No. Yeah, that's not the point that I'm making. The point is that when you're talking about judicial independence, it may very well be perceived as judicial independence to move in a particular direction over another, against the backdrop of this national narrative. So I think that's very important as well. But it is a very good idea to focus on the Prosecutor General in this case as well as others. Over the past 3 years, many complaints, many cases have been brought to the Prosecutor General because that's the nature of Egyptian law. Literally anybody can bring a case against anybody. At the present time, Mohammed al-Baradei, who was vice president up until a few weeks ago, also has a case being drawn against him. The decision of the Prosecutor General in that regard is incredibly key, and that represents a certain amount of intent. And that's what happened under Mohammed Morsi, where many people were brought up on incredibly ridiculous charges, and I'm afraid that that's likely to happen again.
Sajaba, what are your thoughts about the current Prosecutor General, Hesham Barakat?
I have no faith in the judiciary under military rule, because they have already started to cleanse the judiciary, and they have leveled certain charges or accusations against about 70 of them. And I cannot imagine that the military have intervened in order to topple the Muslim Brothers and their followers, and that it will make it easy for them during the trials. Look how many charges were brought by the prosecution, not by people taking, complaining, individual complaints by the public against Morsi, and very quickly, and very, very silly, charges.
Well, like, through some of those.
Morsi was a spy.
Well, we can run through.
Let me see how many. Let me see how many people, how many individuals will dare to take or to lodge a complaint that the Sisi acted against the constitution and against the military, the military law. Because according to military law, Sisi has committed a high treason, and he should be, executed, or he has betrayed the constitution and every law in Egypt. And that's why we should take the matter further and say, since the international community has declared that torture, crimes against humanity, and others are internationally banned, I think it's about the time that democratic countries should also ban coup d'etat, which topple legitimate governments who have been elected or brought into power.
So the problem there is many of these democratic countries
elections.
like to employ coups in countries that they don't like much, quite a bit historically. But let's run through the charges against. Let's go through the charges against the Muslim Brotherhood, because we are going to run out of time soon. Those on trial include the Muslim Brotherhood's spiritual guide, Mohammed Badieh, and 2 of his deputies. They're accused of inciting the murder and attempted murder of protesters who stormed and torched the Brotherhood's headquarters on June the 30th. 9 people were killed, another 91 were wounded. Deposed President Mohammed Morsi is also likely to face these charges. He's also accused of participating in murder and charges relating to his escape from prison in 2011. Are we clear, Hisham, Helia, about the strength of the evidence in these cases as yet?
The accusation of incitement has actually been laid at a great number of people who have been arrested over the past few weeks. And some of the incitement in that regard is actually drawn from satellite television coverage of stages that were at the sit-in and so on. The question is what sentences they're going to be given, and how one defines incitement in that regard. And I think there are grounds for some of the people that were arrested. I can't say all, but some of the people who were arrested, for them to have very serious cases brought against them on the basis of incitement, because we saw a lot of that incitement on television live, carried incidentally by Al Jazeera. So I think that is important for us to keep in mind, that there are legitimate charges, and unfortunately I suspect that there may be other charges that have less grounds, especially ones that question the integrity of this institution or that institution. And unfortunately this is something that we've seen before as well, again under Mohamed Morsi, but also in the past, where people were brought up on charges that seem rather bizarre, but actually have standing. And the way in which those then get taken up in the courts can have very deleterious consequences, not just for those cases, but also for the future. There needs to be quite widespread reform in Egypt in at least two institutions: the security establishment and the judicial system. And people have been calling that for quite some time, but unfortunately over the past 3 years, no government, whether the government under Tantawi or indeed under Mohamed Morsi, and I suspect at present under this government, have been willing to take those reform demands entirely seriously.
Saad, you were nodding your head vigorously while Helia was speaking there. What did you want to say?
Let's not kid ourselves. I mean, when you talk about reforming the judiciary or the security services, the army itself needs to be taken out of the political equation. This is the most important thing. When you have an army ruling a country since 1952, and it took only leave within a year, and they stuck everything to the Muslim Brothers as if they were running the country since 1952. The failure in Egypt is due to that military rule, and the army own a country. They control 70% of the economy of the country. They control, look how Sisi brought 12 ex-generals and put them as governors. So the country is under state of emergency. And plus, I cannot imagine, when you talk about incitement for violence, there are many satellite TV stations in Egypt which are inciting violence against Al Jazeera, against those who are not supporting the regime. Incitement against individuals and institutions, including journalists of Al Jazeera. So let's not, let's be serious. There are so many fabricated charges. The army will do what they want. If the international community does not intervene in favor of the return to the rule of law, a rule of law will not be there without really getting the army out of politics. Egypt is run and owned, or the military army, the military in Egypt own the country, own the economy, own every sector in life. And believe me, they will do it now in the worst manner. And if there is no pressure from the outside world, from the democracies, from the United States firstly, and others, the army will become another Burma. And like the military junta in Burma, which is now gradually going back, or trying to democratize. Right. Egypt is going backward, and Egypt, which used to produce nationally, it's produced in 1960, was equal to that of South Korea. Now, one day production in Korea equals that 1 year of Egypt. So Egypt cannot be a healthy country under military rule. The military don't know how to govern. The militaries are not created to govern.
Well, there's a piece in the New York Times on Sunday there suggesting that hundreds of people are being rounded up, a wide range of people, liberal activists, union leaders and so forth, and their charges being part of the Muslim Brotherhood or incitement to Islamic violence or something like that. I mean, is that the experience that you're witnessing in Egypt?
I think what you see in Egypt at present is actually a number of people who are considered to be against the national narrative being put under a great deal of pressure. And again, this is another reason why I think that judicial reform in Egypt is so incredibly important. And again, it's something that was not taken up over the past 3 years, including under every government that's come through in the last 3 years. And I think that that's entirely blameworthy of all the governments that have come to pass so far. law. And I suspect that unless we see that judicial reform take place, that we will constantly be stuck in this cycle of attacking particular cases.
And we have to leave it there. Thank you very much to my guests, H.A. Helia and Saad Jabbar. And don't forget, you can find this program and many others at aljazeera.com. Just follow the links for shows and Inside Story. Thank you for watching. I'm Shihab Ratansi. Goodbye for now.